So last week we celebrated Palm Sunday here, the end of a Lent season of preparation for Easter. And I told the story that for me, Palm Sunday was like watching this screen where a human tragedy begins in celebration. And the crowd at one moment is crying to Jesus, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, and then crucify. And I gave two modern examples of how we have experienced moments of joy that ended in tragedy. I talked about the Kennedy assassination. 1 minute the crowds are cheering, and the next minute the president is dead. And the car drives through that kind of translucent wall into the future, and we're never the same again. And I talked about the Boston Marathon, a time of celebration and fun and family and people working hard at marathons, and how that ended. And Boston as a community was never quite the same again. Life can turn on a dime, and crucifixions and resurrections take many forms. And so that's kind of the scene that we see before we go through that kind of translucent wall of water into the future. And Easter Day, we're on the other side. And the events of the past week are retold in Holy Week, but actually in scriptures, it's not the story of a week, it's the story of a century that I kind of want to unpack. I want to put the accounts of the resurrection in a context that we can get a hold of this morning. And we think that there is one narrative. We think that there is one story. We think that there's this interpretation of the resurrection. Jesus comes down from heaven like this kind of guy from a spaceship. And he knows everything like Einstein. You can ask him a question, and he knows everything. And on the third day after his crucifixion, he's raised up and he's perfect, and he's this resuscitated corpse. And that's kind of the popular view of how we see Jesus and resurrection and Easter Day. And I want to just turn that inside out for you. And I want us to think about the way that this story, and humanity has been struggling with this. What happened? What happened that week? What happened when Jesus went through that wall into eternity? And in the church we've put up the crucifix is the last part of the earthly Jesus, who was a real person. And we come to this crucifix, which is the Christus Rex, the cosmic Christ. And so in that 100-year reflective process, there is a transformation. And I see it like a cake. Imagine a 3-layer cake. And the first layer of the cake, the bottom layer, is the 30 years of the real life of this man, Jesus of Nazareth. And what we know about him: he's a Jew, he's an itinerant preacher, he's a healer, he's a mystic. He goes around telling stories. He's not here to create a new religion, as some might think, but he sees himself as a social reformer. He and his earthly followers are also Jewish, and they go on to adapt these very Jewish concepts and practices so Gentiles can be a part of the community of God. There's a wonderful book by Marcus Borg. If you want to really look at the difference between the pre-Easter Jesus and the post-Easter Jesus, there's this book by Marcus Borg that I recommend. It's called The God We Never Knew. And Borg kind of, if he was going to give the elevator speech of what happened between this side of the wall and that side of the wall, this is what Borg says. There is a spirit dimension to Jesus, a wisdom dimension to Jesus, a political dimension. Jesus was a Jewish mystic and healer, an enlightened wisdom teacher, and a social prophet. And so many of us that struggle with the idea of a resuscitated corpse, or how does this happen? we might understand and appreciate Jesus from the pre-Easter Jesus that Borg is describing. So that's the first layer of the cake, the historic stuff. Then you have the second layer of the cake, and it's largely from the writings of a man called Paul. And Paul, I would describe as a Jewish fundamentalist. He was an extremist. He wanted to persecute these Jews who were saying that Jesus was the Messiah. And he was riding on his way to Damascus on his horse when this light and this vision changed the whole direction of his life. And it was Jesus who says to him, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So it's interesting that Paul has never met the earthly Jesus. So this is the cosmic Christ. And it's the earliest traditions of the Christian community. The Gospels haven't been written yet. There is no story of a tomb or the linen cloths or Mary Magdalene, the Gospel that Cam read today. That hasn't been written yet. The first experience of the resurrection was a spiritual resurrection. And this profound experience of someone that he's not met before earthly transforms Paul's life. And he moves around these communities and he creates an alternative society to the Roman order where men and women were equal, where Jews and Greeks could be together. In Christ we are one. And it was a radically different, transformative community. And that the experience of the risen Jesus was experienced when people came together. And it was very different from Roman imperial society. In fact, Paul had the audacious claim the titles that were only reserved for the emperor, Son of God, Lord of Lords, Paul begins to use for Jesus. So like saying, Jesus is my president. And it was a kind of radical, different way. So the community of the resurrection, the people who lived and behaved and related differently. Okay, that's the second layer of the cake. So the third layer of the cake are the Gospels themselves. And they were written about AD 60. John's Gospel was written last about AD 90. So it's the icing on the cake. So the third layer takes the earthly life of Jesus, but then they're beginning to weave into the batter of that cake, some of the Old Testament ideas from the Psalms as they're worshiping together, different ideas of Jesus, and the earthly stories of Jesus and this cosmic Christ are woven together. And then by the time you get to the icing, the earthly Jesus is not as significant as the cosmic Christ. In the beginning was the Word. Jesus becomes the Logos of God, and it seeps down. The earthly Jesus is not really that important to John. So within 100 years, we've gone from the earthly Jesus to the cosmic Christ. 100 years of asking the questions and worshiping and interpreting and trying to figure out who this Jesus was. So there are some people here today, they have a hard problem with Easter. And so the opportunity, what I'm saying to you is, there are many interpretations of the resurrection. There isn't one. In fact, the Gospels, many of the accounts conflict. Who got there first? Peter got there first. Mary got there first. What did they see? We don't know. So again, we have all got our own interpretation of what resurrection means and the transformative power of God. I want to bring it really home to us today in St. Peter's and talk about the story of this building. Because this building is a resurrection story. Some of you know the story, but the original St. Peter's was built over at St. Peter's Cemetery in the 1830s. Designed by a guy called Lockwood. Looked like a little bit like the Smithfield Church, a Greek temple church. And on Easter Day, 1880, congregation was gathering, and the sexton had unfortunately put the ashes from the stove close to the foundations. So guess what? The foundations caught fire. The church went up in flames. And the vicar grabbed this Bible, I don't know how they did it, but people grabbed this font, took it out a window. So this is the original font from the church. And there was a prayer book, Book of Common Prayer, from the original church. And they got it out. And you can imagine people who had been married in that church, baptized in that church, said goodbye to loved ones in that church, what they felt. That the kind of glue and the anchor of their community was taken from them on Easter Day. And the people of St. Peter's decided that they were going to have resurrection. And so within a year, they had raised just over $2,000 to build this church on land that was given by the Vandenbergs. The old vicarage was here, so this land was available. This building was put up very quickly. The original building ended where Bindi is sitting, so the sanctuary area had not been built yet. And so the community of St. Peter's worshiped together and continued. And families began then to finish the windows. These cathedral windows were put in. So that was consecrated in 1880. 1886, some of the families in the community put in the sackets and the fitches, these windows, these beautiful windows that you don't often see when you're sitting in church, were put in. But there is an amazing story about this window called the Old Rugged Cross that I want to tell you. It was a memorial to Cyrus and Caroline Hammond. They died. David Hammond was their son, and he married this woman called Lydia. They were married across the street. And within 2 weeks of their marriage, David's mother died. Caroline died, was buried at St. Peter's. And 5 years after their marriage, his wife Lydia died in childbirth. And so you could imagine the devastation. And all the families were all related and knew each other and supported each other. So this was a huge blow to the community. And David, in memorial to his parents and his wife and child, erected the screen behind the altar. So that's got their name on it. And this window, that's a remarkable window. And from your perspective, it looks like it's kind of a couple of panes. But if you look at it close up, it's actually very separate medallions of glass. It's cut rough glass, beautifully cut. So it's these gems that are held together by molten lead that has been fired. And each of them represents a kind of story, a kind of way that we look at resurrection. I'm sure for David Hammond, there was a way when he looked at this window. And for 130 Easters, the people sitting where you are have looked at this window. And what's remarkable about it, last night we were here for the great vigil. We light this fire, and Cam sings the Exultet, this ancient Christian hymn. We carry the Paschal candle into the darkened church. And it was interesting seeing this window in a different time of day, because it changes depending on what's going on outside. If it's a gray day or a sunny day, the light of this window changes. And what came to me was a sense in which all of the pieces, it's rather like that 100 years reflection. The bottom, the rocks in the bottom of the cross is the early traditions of St. Paul, the communities that he founded, and that the experience of Christ risen was part of that. And then the 4 parts of the cross are the Gospels, each with their own interpretation of the earthly Jesus, who was that central, beautiful, golden piece of glass. And so all of that. So we have this magnificent remembrance of what the resurrection means in our day. So I went over to the cemetery on Good Friday, and I found the grave, and David Greenwood, who's our parish historian, has been giving me some background. And Hammond he never remarried. He was totally brokenhearted by this loss. And he went on, his family owned a farm, Murray Hill Farm, If you stand in front of Grand Central Station looking down Park Avenue, they owned about 4 or 5 blocks that you could see. And they built this huge hotel, 600-room hotel, in the 1870s, I think, that was one of the most beautiful, classiest hotels in the country. So he went on to become a really successful businessman in New York. And Hammond, there's still legacy of the Hammond name. The hotel was pulled down in 1945 to make room for a couple of buildings. But his legacy, when he died 1900, he was so beloved and respected. David Greenwood told me that the flowers that covered the St. Peter's Cemetery cost $1,700 in the year 1900. So he was an amazing man. But I believe the most important legacy that David Hammond left us is this window. So when you come up, when you come forward for communion, where we pass through the veil, where we are surrounded by those who have gone before us, look up and look at the medallions, look at the shape of the window, explore it, see the name that is written, the names that are written behind the screen. And so we are invited to see the resurrection in the way that we see it today. Christ is risen. Death has no longer dominion over him. He is not here, but has gone before us. And those words of Jesus to Mary are so profound. Go and tell the disciples that I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Amen.